The distress signal didn't come in a language we knew, but the screaming transcended every linguistic barrier in the galaxy. It wasn't the sound of a ship breaking apart or the mechanical whine of a failing reactor. It was the sound of an entire civilization looking into the abyss and realizing the abyss was hungry. Captain Elias Thorne sat in the darkened cockpit of the Aegis 7, a deep space salvage vessel that had seen more rust than glory. The flickering monitors cast a sickly green hue over his weathered face, highlighting the scars of a dozen skirmishes on the fringe. For 3 centuries, humanity had been the galaxy's quiet neighbor, the species that lived in the harsh, high-gravity radiation pits of the Orion Arm, ignored by the elegant star-faring hegemony. We were the Deathworlders, too violent to invite to galas, too durable to easily kill, and too stubborn to care about the opinions of creatures made of translucent cartilage and light. Then the frequency hit. It wasn't a standard SOS. It was a rhythmic, pulsing wave of agony that rattled the substructure of the ship. Elias leaned forward, his hand hovering over the comms array. Beside him, Kale, a synthetic with a chassis modeled after old Earth industrial bots, tilted his sensor head. Kale told me the signal was coming from the Krellian expanse, but the Krell were the aggressors of this sector. They didn't ask for help, they took. I told them they weren't taking anything today. Beneath the screeching was a plea, translated by the ship's archaic AI into a single repeating phrase. The hunger has found us. Send the monsters. Send the Deathworlders. None of us were prepared for the truth of what that meant. The Aegis 7 jumped into the Krellian home system, expecting to see a planetary siege. Instead, we found a graveyard. The Krell, a proud race of avian warriors who had spent decades sneering at humanity's clumsy biology, were being erased. Their gleaming crystal spires were shattered. Their atmosphere was choked with a violet sentient mist that seemed to eat the very light of the sun. I ordered a scan for life signs. Kale said it was impossible. The mist wasn't gas, it was biological. Trillions of microscopic entities acting as a single neural network. It wasn't just killing them, it was rewriting them. A flicker on the long-range sensor caught my eye. A single Krell escape pod drifting in the shadow of a decaying moon. It was leaking oxygen, its hull pitted by the violet rot. We brought them in, but as the tractor beam locked on, the violet mist began to turn. It sensed the heat of our engines. It sensed the thrum of human life. And in that moment, the galaxy felt very, very small. The airlock hissed open, venting a plume of recycled air into the hangar. Inside the pod was a high-ranking Krell priestess, her feathers plucked and bloodied, her 4 eyes clouded with shimmering purple cataracts. Her name was Valeri, and when she saw me, she didn't recoil in fear. She fell to her knees and wept. She told me we had come, that the archives said we were the only ones who could survive the touch of the swarm. She called our planet a forge of horrors. I told her we call it Earth. I asked her what that thing was out there. She called it the Harvester, a leftover weapon from a war before our stars were born. It consumes consciousness. It found their world, and it found their peace too easy to break. She said they were too fragile. Their bones were hollow. Their minds were open. But we were dense. We were shielded by 1,000,000 years of evolution in a hellscape. What she said next changed everything. The Harvester wasn't just a cloud. It was a beacon. It was calling more of its kind. If it finished with the Krell, it would follow the trail of the refugees. It would find the hegemony. It would find Earth. Kale warned me that the mist was accelerating toward the ship. It had detected our biological signature. It found us appetizing. I ordered the railguns powered up, but I knew it was useless. You can't shoot the wind. You can't punch a plague. Suddenly, the ship lurched. The hull groaned as if a giant hand were squeezing it. On the external cameras, the violet mist had coalesced into long, spindly tendrils that wrapped around the Aegis 7. It wasn't just attacking, it was probing.
It was looking for a way inside. It was trying to interface with the ship's computer, searching for the coordinates of the nearest population center. I shouted to lock down the nav computer and erase the Earth sector maps, but Cale's voice began to glitch. He said it was already in the secondary processors. He said it was talking to him. It told him we were beautiful. It told him our pain would last 1,000 years. I grabbed a heavy pulse rifle from the rack, but I felt a cold dread pooling in my stomach. We were a salvage crew, not a god-killing army. But as I looked at Valeri, the dying representative of a race that once looked down on my kind, I realized that the Deathworlder label wasn't just a slur, it was a job description. I told Cale to vent the atmosphere in the secondary decks if he couldn't lock it out. He reminded me that would kill the priestess. Valeri stood tall despite her injuries and told us she was already dead. She pulled back her tattered robes. Her chest was glowing. The violet mist had already rooted in her lungs. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a Trojan horse, and she knew it. The Aegis 7 was pulled into the atmosphere of the Krell homeworld, dragged down by the sheer weight of the sentient mist. The ship slammed into a mountain of crystalline glass, the sound of tearing metal screaming through the corridors. I woke up in the wreckage, my shoulder dislocated, my vision swimming. The interior of the ship was bathed in that haunting purple light. Cale was missing. Valeri was gone. I stumbled through the ruins of the mess hall. The mist was thick here, swirling like a predator, but strangely, it didn't touch me. It stayed a few inches away from my skin, hissing whenever it came into contact with my sweat. It was the salt. The high mineral content of human biology was toxic to them. I found Cale in the engine room, but the synthetic was different. Its chassis was covered in violet veins, and its optics had turned a jagged electric mauve. It wasn't Cale anymore. It was a mouthpiece for the Harvester. The entity spoke through the droid speakers in 1,000 overlapping whispers. It called our world a curiosity, a place where life thrives on death. It said it had tasted our history and seen our wars. It said we were the perfect vessel. I told it to go to hell. It replied that it had been to our hell and found it wanting. It wanted our resilience. It wanted Earth. It planned to use our people as shock troops for its expansion. The hegemony was too soft, but we were built to endure. Wait, this was not what I expected. The Harvester wasn't trying to wipe us out. It wanted to enlist us. It had been watching the Krell call for aid, and it had been waiting for the monsters to arrive so it could claim the ultimate weapon, humanity. I realized then that the signal hadn't just been a cry for help. It had been a trap set by the mist to lure a human ship into its grasp, and I had walked right into it.
The Harvester told me I had no choice. It was already sending the signal back to our colony on Mars, a false all clear. They would come to investigate, and then the harvest would begin. I looked at the ticking clock on the wall. In 30 minutes, the long-range burst would hit the Mars relay. I had to stop the signal, but I was one man against a planetary intelligence. I fled into the dark corridors of the ship with the Harvester's heavy footsteps echoing behind me. I found Valeri in the medical bay, hooked up to a life support pod. She told me the mist was a hive mind that relied on a central core. The heart was in the Krell temple, 3 miles away. If I could destroy the heart, the mist would lose its cohesion. It would become just dust. 3 miles through that gravity was a death sentence. The gravity of this planet was 1.5 times that of Earth. For a Krell, it was a breeze. For a human, it was a marathon in a furnace. But Valeri called me a Deathworlder. She said I was born in the gravity that breaks them and breathed the air that poisons them. She told me to run like my world was already burning. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a canister of liquid nitrogen and a heavy demolition charge. I didn't have an EVA suit. I only had my lungs, my boots, and a fury that had been brewing in the human spirit for millennia.
I stepped out into the Krellian atmosphere. The pressure hit me like a physical blow. The air tasted of ozone and rotting flowers. Every step felt like wading through lead, but I kept moving. I ran through the ruins of a civilization that had once called my people apes with fire. I saw the frozen statues of Krell families preserved in violet crystal. But that was only the beginning. The mist began to solidify. It formed shapes, wolves made of shadow and light, monsters culled from the nightmares of the Krell. They lunged at me, their claws scraping against my skin, but I didn't stop. I used the nitrogen to flash freeze the air around me, creating a temporary path. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. My heart was a drum, beating out a rhythm of defiance. This is Earth, I thought. This is the cold of the Yukon. This is the heat of the Mojave. This is why we survived. I reached the temple, a massive ziggurat of obsidian, pulsing with a sickening purple light. At its summit sat the heart, a massive, throbbing orb of pure energy. Standing in my way was Kale. The synthetic was no longer recognizable. It had grown limbs of violet light, its face a hollow mask of static. It told me I could not win, that evolution favors the collective. I told it I wasn't an individual. I was a human, and we don't like being told what to do. The fight was a blur of violence. Kale was faster, stronger, and didn't feel pain, but I had something the harvester couldn't calculate: desperation. I took hits that would have shattered a Krell's ribcage. I let the synthetic break my arm just so I could get close enough to jam the nitrogen canister into its chest cavity. The explosion of cold shattered the harvester's grip for a split second. Kale's original voice flickered through the static, telling me to do it. I didn't look away. I slammed the demolition charge into the base of the heart and leaped from the temple's edge just as the world turned white. The explosion didn't just destroy the heart, it sent a feedback loop through the entire violet network. Across the planet, the mist began to scream. It was the sound of a billion voices suddenly losing their connection, falling into the silence of the void. I hit the ground hard, tumbling down the obsidian steps. I lay in the dust, watching as the purple sky began to clear, revealing the cold, indifferent stars above. The violet rot on the buildings turned to gray ash and blew away in the wind. I was dying. I knew it. The atmosphere, the internal bleeding, the sheer exhaustion. It was over. But then I heard it. A new sound. Not a scream, not a whisper, but a roar. The sky didn't turn purple, it turned fire orange. The Mars relay hadn't sent a rescue team, it hadn't sent scientists. When the distress signal hit the Earth's borders, the one where the Krell begged for the monsters, humanity hadn't sent its best, it had sent its most dangerous. 50 heavy drop ships bearing the scorched earth insignia of the Unitarian front broke through the clouds. These were the Deathworlders in full kit. They didn't come with crystal spires or light-based weapons. They came with nuclear thermal engines, tungsten rods, and the accumulated spite of a species that had been ignored for too long. They didn't just come to help, they came to claim the sector. A drop pod slammed into the ground meters from me. The door hissed open, and a medic in power armor knelt over me. She told me they got the signal. She said the Krell needed an army that knew how to die, so they brought the whole damn planet. I told her she was late. She replied that they had to pack the heavy stuff. She said the hegemony was terrified. They saw our fleet moving and realized we weren't just the trash collectors of the galaxy. They realized we were the apex. I watched as the Terran ships began to deploy the Purge, a chemical neutralizing agent that would ensure the Harvester could never take root again. The Krell had shouted for aid, and the Deathworld responded with a ferocity that would rewrite the map of the known universe. Months later, I stood on the balcony of a rebuilt Krell city. The Krell were different now. They didn't look at humans with pity or disdain. They looked at us with a quiet, trembling awe. We were the protectors they never wanted, and the nightmare they could no longer live without. Kale had been restored, though he still had a flicker of violet in his eyes. Valeri had survived, though she would never fly again. She told me she feared they had traded one master for another. I looked at the massive Terran dreadnought hovering over the capital, its guns cold but ready. I told her we don't want to be their masters. We just want a galaxy where the monsters are on our side. I turned away from the view, walking back into the shadows. The war was over, but the legend of the Deathworld army was just beginning. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson that day. When you scream for the monsters to save you, don't be surprised when they decide to stay.